The scream came from the garden before dawn, and Ilara was already running before she understood why. She had been asleep for maybe 2 hours. The bonding ceremony had ended late, the fires had burned low, and the whole pack had gone home with the particular kind of joy that only comes once in a lifetime. She had a mate now, Kale. The name still felt strange and wonderful in her mouth, like a word from a language she was only beginning to learn. But the scream had not come from joy. She threw open the back door and found her mother kneeling in the vegetable patch, hands buried in soil that should have been dark and rich, and was instead gray and cracked, as if something had burned through it from beneath. Every plant in the row was wilted flat, stems blackened at the base, leaves curled like they were trying to protect themselves from something that had already won. "It happened again," her mother whispered, not looking up. "Just like before." Ilara did not know what before meant. She had never seen anything like this in her life. But she saw her sister Wren standing at the edge of the garden, arms wrapped around herself, staring at the ruined plants with an expression that looked almost like satisfaction if you caught it at the wrong angle. Ilara caught it at the wrong angle. And then Wren's face rearranged itself into something softer, more worried, more suitable for the moment, and Ilara told herself she had imagined it. She would spend the next several weeks wishing she had trusted her first instinct. By mid-morning, half the pack had heard about the garden. By mid-afternoon, the story had grown teeth. Someone said the soil had smelled of sulfur. Someone else said they'd seen shadows moving without bodies attached to them the night before. None of it was true, but truth was never as fast as fear, and fear moved through the pack like water through a cracked dam. Ilara tried to focus on the one good thing in her life. Kale had asked to see her that evening, and despite the strange, sour mood hanging over her family's house, she dressed with care and walked to the ridge where they had agreed to meet. He was already there when she arrived, watching the valley below with his hands in his pockets, and when he turned to her, his smile was the same warm, unguarded thing it had been the night before. "I heard about the garden," he said gently. "Is your mother all right?" "She's shaken. It's strange. Things like this don't just happen." "No," he agreed. "They don't." He didn't say anything else about it, and she was grateful, because she didn't want their first real evening together to be swallowed by her family's troubles. They talked about small things. The mountains he'd grown up near, the way she'd always wanted to see the coast, the ridiculous nickname his cousin had given him as a child that he refused, at first, to repeat. She made him laugh twice. He made her forget, for almost 2 hours, that anything in the world could go wrong. When she finally walked home under a sky full of hard, clear stars, she felt lighter than she had in days. She did not know that while she was on the ridge with Kale, her sister was sitting with their elderly aunt, telling her, in a voice pitched perfectly between reluctance and concern, that their grandmother had once spoken of an old family stain, a darkness that skipped generations, and always seemed to land on whoever loved the hardest. Their grandmother had said no such thing. She had been dead for 6 years, and could not correct the record. Wren knew this. It was, in fact, the entire reason she had chosen that particular lie. The next few days passed in a strange, uneasy quiet. Nothing else happened to the garden. The pack's fear cooled the way fear often does when it has nothing fresh to feed on. Ilara allowed herself to believe the worst was over. She met Kale twice more that week, once for a long walk through the eastern woods, where he showed her a waterfall he claimed was his favorite place in the world, and once simply to sit together on her family's porch, while her mother pretended not to watch them from the kitchen window. It was on the porch that Wren found them, appearing with 2 cups of tea she hadn't been asked to bring, settling herself into the chair across from them, with the easy grace of someone who had rehearsed the entrance. "I hope I'm not interrupting," she said, in a tone that made clear she did not particularly care if she was. "Not at all," Kale said, because he was kind, and because he had no reason yet to be anything other than kind to the sister of the woman he loved. Wren smiled and sipped her tea and steered the conversation, gently at first, toward the garden. She spoke of it almost sorrowfully, as though she found the whole subject painful, and in doing so, managed to plant, seed by careful seed, the idea that these things had happened before in their family. She mentioned an aunt on their father's side who had left home young and never come back, and let the silence afterward suggest whatever the listener wanted it to suggest. She never once said the word curse. She was far too clever for that. She only built a shape in the air and let other people fill it in with their own imaginations. Alara noticed none of it. She was too happy, too distracted by the warmth of Cale's hand resting near hers on the porch railing, to hear the undertow beneath her sister's words. But Cale noticed something, not the lie itself, he had no way yet to see that, but a small, cold current running beneath the conversation, a feeling he could not name and did not mention, because it seemed unfair to judge a family he barely knew on the strength of a feeling. He left that evening with a version of unease he had never carried before, small and quiet, tucked into the back of his thoughts like a stone in a shoe. It did not stop him from wanting to see Alara again, but it sat there, waiting, the way small doubts do, for something to make it grow. 3 nights later, something did. A neighboring family's livestock pen turned up in ruin, 2 goats dead, no visible wound, no tracks, no explanation the local healer could offer beyond a helpless shrug and a mutter about bad luck running through the valley. It should not have had anything to do with Alara. She had not been near that farm in weeks. But Wren made sure, in her quiet, careful way, that a few people remembered Alara had once been there, months ago, on an errand for their mother, and that a few people remembered, or believed they remembered, an argument Alara had once had with the farm's owner over a debt long since paid. None of it added up to proof. All of it added up to a feeling, and feelings, once they take root in a frightened community, are far harder to pull out than facts ever are. Alara felt the shift before she understood its cause. People who had greeted her warmly for years began offering thinner smiles, shorter conversations, eyes that slid away a half-second too quickly. She told herself she was imagining it. She told herself the same thing 3 days later, when Cale, meeting her at their usual spot by the ridge, seemed distracted, his warmth present, but somehow thinner, stretched over something she couldn't see. "Is everything all right?" she asked him. "Yes," he said, too quickly. "Just tired. Long week." She wanted to believe him. She almost did. That night, walking home alone, she passed her sister's window and saw a light still burning, and heard, faintly, the low murmur of Wren's voice, speaking to someone Alara could not identify. She thought nothing of it. She had no reason yet to think anything of it. Wren had always been the sociable one, the one who stayed up late trading gossip and small favors with half the young people in the pack. It was, Alara believed, simply who her sister was. She did not yet understand that her sister's sociability had become a weapon, aimed, patiently and precisely, at her. The days that followed carried a strange, low hum of tension that Alara could feel but not name. It was in the way conversations stopped a beat too soon when she entered a room. It was in the careful, overly gentle way her mother now spoke to her, as though Alara were something fragile that might shatter, or, worse, something dangerous that might shatter everyone else. It was in Cale's visits, which continued, but with a new hesitance in them, a space between his words that had not existed before. She asked him about it once, directly, on an evening when the silence between them had grown too heavy to ignore. "You've been different," she said. "Since the garden, since the goats. Is it me?" Cale looked at her for a long moment, and in his eyes she saw something that frightened her more than any rumor could have. Not suspicion exactly, but the early shape of it, the first thin crack in a foundation that had, only weeks ago, seemed unbreakable. "I don't know what it is," he admitted. "I hear things, small things. I don't believe them. I want you to know that. I don't believe them. But I hear them, and I can't seem to stop hearing them." "What things?" He hesitated, and in that hesitation, Alara understood that whatever he had heard, he did not want to be the one to say it aloud, as if speaking it might give it a strength it did not yet possess. "It doesn't matter," he said finally. "I trust you." She wanted to press him further, but something in his face told her that pressing would only widen the gap between them, so she let it go, and told herself that trust, once spoken aloud, was a promise that would hold. She did not yet know how carefully her sister had built the trap they were both standing in. One soft word at a time, one worried glance at a time, one small and deniable piece of evidence at a time. She did not know that Wren had begun visiting an elder on the far side of the valley, a woman named Odette, who was owed a debt from years past, and who could, with the right encouragement, be persuaded to confirm almost anything a frightened community wanted confirmed. She did not know that her sister's quiet conversations, the ones drifting through lit windows late at night, were not idle gossip but careful architecture, each brick laid with patience, each brick designed to look, from any angle Ilara might view it, like nothing at all. All Ilara knew, as she walked home that night beneath a sky gone suddenly colder, was that something in her life that had felt solid only weeks before, now felt like it was standing on ground that might, without warning, give way beneath her feet. She did not know yet how right that feeling was. She only knew that for the first time since the bonding ceremony, she was afraid, and she did not know what she was afraid of, and that not knowing was its own kind of dread, quiet and constant, following her home through the dark like a second shadow she had not asked for and could not shake. She lay awake long after the house had gone silent, listening to the wind move through the trees outside her window, turning over every strange look, every clipped conversation, every flicker of hesitation in Kale's eyes, searching for a pattern she could not yet see. Somewhere in the valley, a fire still burned in a window that was not her own, and behind that light, her sister sat awake too, though for reasons entirely different, counting, with quiet satisfaction, how close she had already come to taking everything Ilara had. By morning, the frost on the fields had come early, sharp and silver, and Ilara stood at her window, watching it settle over the garden that had never fully recovered from whatever had struck it weeks before. She did not know it yet, but the frost was the least of what was coming. The whispers had already begun their slow crawl through the valley, moving from house to house, mouth to mouth, gathering weight with every retelling, and at the center of every version, whether anyone said her name aloud or not, stood Ilara, unaware that the life she had only just begun to build was already being quietly, deliberately, unmade. The frost did not melt for 3 days, and neither did the strange chill that had settled over Ilara's household. Her mother moved through the kitchen with the careful, muted steps of someone trying not to wake a sleeping animal. Her father, always a quiet man, had gone quieter still, spending long hours mending fences that did not need mending, as if physical work could hold off whatever was pressing in on his family from the edges. And Ren, through all of it, seemed to bloom. She had never been unkind to Ilara's face. That was the trick of it. She brought her tea in the mornings. She asked after Kale, with what looked like genuine sisterly interest. She sat beside their mother in the evenings, murmuring comfort, offering to run errands, making herself indispensable in 100 small ways that no one thought to question, because who would question kindness? Ilara certainly did not. She had grown up believing her sister loved her, in the uneven, competitive way that sisters often do, and it did not occur to her that the girl bringing her tea in the morning was the same girl quietly widening the crack in her life every time she left the room. The elder named Odette lived on the far side of the valley, in a house that smelled of dried herbs and old smoke, and she had not always been poor. Years before, her family had lost a parcel of land in a dispute that Ren's grandfather had judged, unfairly, in favor of another family. Odette had never forgotten it, and when Ren came to her one evening with a soft voice and a heavier purse than a girl her age should have carried, Odette understood immediately what kind of visit this was, even before Ren said a single word about curses or blood or old family stains. "Your sister has been fortunate," Odette said, when Ren finally spoke. "Fortune makes people uneasy. They start looking for reasons it might not last." "I only want people to understand what's happening," Ren said. "It isn't my fault if they draw their own conclusions." Odette smiled, the way old women smile when they have long since stopped believing anyone's protests of innocence. "No," she agreed, "it never is." 3 days later, when a young man from the western houses asked Odette directly whether such a curse could be real, she did not lie outright. She was too careful, too experienced, for anything so clumsy. She simply said that such things had happened before, in other valleys, in other families, and that it was never wise to dismiss what the old stories warned against. She said it with just enough uncertainty to sound honest, and just enough weight to sound like confirmation, and by the time the young man repeated her words to his own family that night, the uncertainty had vanished entirely, leaving only the weight behind. Ilara heard the story secondhand 3 days after that, from a friend who told her gently, awkwardly, clearly wishing she did not have to be the one to say it. Ilara laughed at first, certain it was some misunderstanding, some exaggeration that had grown in the retelling the way exaggerations always do. But the friend did not laugh with her, and slowly Ilara's smile faded into something colder and more afraid. "People actually believe this?" she asked. "Some do," the friend admitted. "Not everyone. But enough." That evening, Ilara went looking for Kale, and found him later than usual, standing outside the meeting hall where the pack's senior members sometimes gathered to discuss matters too delicate for open conversation. He looked tired, in a way she had not seen before, the kind of tired that came from carrying something heavy for too long without setting it down. "They're talking about me in there," she said. It wasn't a question. Kale's silence was answer enough. "Say something," she said, and heard her own voice crack on the second word. "Please, tell me you don't believe any of this." "I don't," he said, and his voice was steady, but his eyes were not, sliding briefly toward the hall behind him before returning to her face. "I told them so. I told them I've known you for weeks, that I've felt nothing from you but warmth, that whatever happened to that garden and those goats has nothing to do with you. But Ilara, I can't make other people stop being afraid. I can't reach into their heads and pull the fear out. Can you reach into your own?" He flinched, just slightly, and that flinch told her everything his words had tried to hide. Somewhere, in some small, unguarded corner of his mind, the fear had found a foothold in him too. "I love you," he said, and it was the first time he had said it aloud, and it landed strangely, wonderfully, and terribly at once, a gift handed to her in the middle of a storm. "I want you to know that whatever happens, I love you, but I would be lying if I said none of this has gotten to me. I hear it from every direction. My own cousin asked me yesterday if I was frightened to sleep beside you. I told him no. But Ilara, I lay awake last night longer than I should have, and I don't fully understand why." She wanted to be angry with him. Some small, wounded part of her was angry with him, but a larger part understood, with a clarity that frightened her more than his doubt did, that he was not the villain of this story. He was simply a good man, being slowly poisoned by a lie he could not see, administered by a hand he had no reason yet to suspect. "It's my sister," she said suddenly, the thought arriving whole and certain, as though it had been assembling itself in the back of her mind for weeks, and had only now finished. "It's Ren. I don't know how, I don't know why, but it's her." Kale's face went carefully blank, the expression of a man trying to be fair to two people he cared about at once. "That's a serious thing to say." "I know it is. Do you have proof?" She didn't. Not yet. And the absence of it sat in her chest like a stone, because she understood, even as she said her sister's name aloud for the first time as an accusation, that suspicion without proof was worth nothing, especially against someone as careful, as beloved, as endlessly, effortlessly kind-seeming as Ren. She went home that night and sat across from her sister at the dinner table, watching her with new eyes, searching her familiar face for something she might have missed for years. Ren ate calmly, asked about Kale with what still sounded like real concern, offered to walk with Ilara the next morning to clear her head. Ilara accepted the offer, not because she wanted the company, but because she wanted to watch. The walk revealed nothing. Ren was too careful for that. She spoke only of comforting things, of childhood memories, of a future where all of this would surely blow over and be forgotten. She was so convincing that for a full hour, walking beside her sister under a pale morning sky, Ilara almost believed she had been wrong, that grief and fear had made her paranoid, that the sister walking beside her really was only trying to help. It was on the way back, passing near the old well at the edge of their family's land, that Ilara noticed the disturbed earth. A small patch, freshly turned, tucked behind a cluster of stones where no one would think to look unless they were looking for something specific. She said nothing. She only marked the spot in her memory and let her sister lead her home, chatting easily the whole way, utterly unaware that for the first time, Ilara had found a thread worth pulling. That night, Ilara returned alone, moving carefully through the dark with a small lantern shielded against the wind, and knelt beside the disturbed earth behind the stones. She dug with her bare hands, slow and careful, until her fingers struck something small and hard, wrapped in cloth. She unwrapped it there in the dark, hands trembling, and found a charm, crude and deliberate, bound with the same kind of hair that grew from her own head, tied with red thread in a pattern she did not recognize but understood, instinctively, was meant to look like something dark and ceremonial. It was not real magic. She knew enough of her family's actual traditions to know that. It was theater, built to be discovered, built to look exactly like the kind of thing frightened people would believe confirmed every rumor they had already been primed to believe. Someone had planted it there, near her family's land, close enough to Kale's usual path home that it would eventually, inevitably, be found by someone who was not her. She sat in the dark for a long time, the false charm resting in her lap, and felt something inside her that was not quite anger and not quite grief, but some new, sharper thing assembled from both. She understood, finally and completely, the shape of what had been done to her, and she understood that understanding it was not the same as being able to prove it. Not yet. Not against a sister who had spent weeks building a story so careful that Alara herself had almost believed it. She wrapped the charm back in its cloth and carried it home, hidden beneath her coat, and did not sleep that night at all. She sat by her window watching the dark fields, turning the object over and over in her hands, and began, for the first time since the trouble had started, to think not like a frightened woman, but like someone preparing for a fight. She did not yet know how long that fight would be, or how far she would have to travel to win it fairly. She only knew that she was no longer willing to stand still and let the lie finish what it had started. By the time the sun rose, pale and cold over the frost-hardened fields, Ilara had made a decision that would carry her, eventually, far beyond the borders of the only home she had ever known, toward a place where lies could not survive the light that was waited there to meet them. The invitation never came, and its absence said more than any words could have. Every year, the valley held a gathering at the turn of the season, a night of shared food and old songs meant to bind the pack together before the harder months set in. Ilara had attended every year of her life without a single thought of whether she was welcome. This year, when the day arrived, no one came to walk with her the way they usually did. No one saved her a place near the fire, and when she arrived on her own, a little late, a little uncertain, she felt the silence fall over the gathering like a physical weight. She stood at the edge of the firelight for a long moment before her mother's cousin, a broad, kind-faced man named Corwin, who had never had an unkind word for her in his life, came to speak to her, his voice low and apologetic. "It might be better," he said, not meeting her eyes, "if you didn't stay tonight. Some of the families are uneasy. Nothing personal, you understand. Just until things settle." "Until things settle," Ilara repeated. "And who decides when that is?" Corwin had no answer for that, because there was no good answer, and they both knew it. She left without argument, because arguing with a man who so clearly did not want to be having this conversation would only make the ache in her chest worse. She walked home under a moon that seemed, that night, unusually indifferent to her, and did not cry until she was well past the tree line, out of sight of anyone who might report even her tears as further evidence of something unnatural. Behind her, at the gathering she'd been turned away from, Wren sat close to the fire, laughing softly at something Odette had said, glowing with the particular warmth of someone whose long, patient work was finally bearing fruit. Kale found Ilara 3 nights later, at the ridge where they had once spent so many easy, unhurried evenings together. He looked older than she remembered him looking, only weeks before, the lightness gone out of his shoulders, replaced by something heavier and more careful. "Odette spoke to me," he said, without preamble, directly, not through rumor. "She said your family has old blood in it, blood that turns on the people closest to it. And you believed her. I don't know what I believe anymore." He ran a hand through his hair, a gesture she had once found endearing and now found unbearable, because it was the gesture of a man losing his footing. "I look at you and I feel exactly what I felt the night we bonded. Nothing has changed in me toward you. But then I hear these things, from people I've trusted my whole life, people who have no reason to lie to me, and I don't know how to hold both of those truths at once." "They have every reason to lie to you," Ilara said, "or to be lied to themselves. Kale, I found something. Behind the old well. A charm, buried where it would be found. It isn't real magic. It's a prop. Someone planted it there to be discovered. She watched his face carefully as she spoke, searching for the flicker of belief she needed, and found instead something more complicated, something caught between wanting to trust her and having been taught, gently and repeatedly, over weeks, to doubt. Who would do that? You know who. Ilara. His voice was gentle, but it carried a warning in it now, the warning of a man who did not want to hear his suspicions spoken aloud, because speaking it would force him to choose. She's your sister. She's grieved for you, worried over you, defended you to people who wanted to believe far worse. I've seen it myself. You've seen what she wanted you to see. They stood there in the cooling evening air, the distance between them wider than it had ever been, though neither of them had physically moved. Ilara understood, in that moment, that she could not win this argument standing alone on a ridge, with nothing but an unproven object wrapped in cloth. She needed something Ren could not talk her way around. She needed truth that did not depend on anyone's willingness to believe it. I'm not asking you to choose right now, she said finally. I'm asking you to wait, to not decide anything final until I can prove what I know. Can you give me that much? Kale was quiet for a long moment, long enough that she began to fear the answer, and when he finally spoke, his voice was rough with something that might have been the last honest feeling left between them. I can give you that, he said, but Ilara, I don't know how much longer the rest of the pack will wait. There's talk of bringing this before the council, formally. If that happens, I won't be able to stand outside it and stay neutral. I'll be asked to speak, one way or another. She nodded, because there was nothing else to do, and watched him walk away down the ridge, his shape growing smaller and smaller against the darkening hills, until she could no longer tell whether the ache in her chest was fear for what was coming, or grief for what had already, quietly, begun to slip away. The council meeting was called 8 days later. It was held in the same hall where Ilara had once stood outside, listening to muffled voices discuss her without her permission, and this time she was told, plainly, that she was required to attend. She walked in with her chin raised and her hands folded carefully in front of her, refusing to let anyone see how badly they trembled. The hall was full, fuller than she had ever seen it. Every family in the valley represented, every face turned toward her with some mixture of curiosity, pity, or open suspicion. Ren sat near the front, beside their mother, her expression carefully arranged into something between sorrow and support, the perfect picture of a sister standing by family in a difficult hour. The pack's eldest, a stern, fair-minded woman named Adeline, who had presided over the valley's disputes for longer than Ilara had been alive, called the meeting to order and laid out, in careful, measured terms, the concerns that had been raised. The garden, the goats, the whispered history of a curse that ran in Ilara's blood. She did not accuse Ilara outright. Adeline was too scrupulous for that. But she asked, directly, whether Ilara had any explanation to offer. Ilara stood, and for a moment the words would not come, caught somewhere between the fear in her chest and the anger simmering just beneath it. Then she thought of the charm hidden in her coat, and of the disturbed earth behind the stones, and she found her voice. I have no curse, she said. I have never had a curse. What I have is a sister who buried a false charm behind our family's old well, meant to be discovered and mistaken for proof of something that was never real. I found it before anyone else could. I have it here, if the council wishes to examine it. A ripple moved through the hall, murmurs rising and falling like wind through grass. Ren's face, for the briefest instant, showed something raw and unguarded. Not guilt exactly, but the sharp, startled look of someone who has just realized the ground beneath them is not as solid as they believed. Then, just as quickly, it smoothed over into wounded disbelief. That's not true, Ren said, rising to her feet, her voice trembling in a way that sounded, to every ear in the room except Ilara's, entirely genuine. How can you say that about me? I've done nothing but try to protect this family. If anything, it seems like Ilara is the one trying to plant blame somewhere else, now that she's been discovered. The murmurs shifted, uncertain now, pulled between two sisters who both, in their own ways, sounded convincing. Adeline raised a hand for silence, and studied them both with the patient, unreadable expression of a woman who had seen more lies told in that hall than most people saw in a lifetime. "This council does not deal in accusations without proof," she said finally. "Ilara, you say you have an object. Bring it forward. But understand, an object alone, without a witness to how it came to be there, proves very little. If this dispute cannot be settled here, in this valley, among people who know both of you, it may need to be carried further, to a place where truth can be examined more thoroughly than we are equipped to examine it." Ilara felt something cold and clear settle over her, cutting through the fear that had gripped her chest all evening. She understood, standing in that hall full of divided, uncertain faces, that Adeline was right. This valley, full of history and old loyalties, and a sister who had spent weeks weaving herself into every corner of it, was not a place where the truth could win cleanly. She would need somewhere larger, somewhere the old tricks of whispered doubt and buried charms would mean nothing against the weight of real law. "Then I will carry it further," she said, her voice steady now, steadier than she had expected it to be. "If this valley cannot judge fairly, I will take it to the Moon Court." The hall went silent at that, the kind of silence that follows a decision too large to argue with immediately. Even Wren said nothing, though something flickered behind her eyes that looked, for the first time, like fear rather than performance. Adeline studied Ilara for a long moment, and then nodded, slow and grave. "That is your right," she said. "The Moon Court does not judge lightly, and it does not judge kindly toward those who bring false claims before it. Be certain, Ilara, before you walk that road." "I am certain," Ilara said, and found, to her own quiet surprise, that she meant it completely. She left the hall that night with the eyes of the entire valley following her, some sympathetic, some suspicious, most simply uncertain, and walked home through the cold dark alone, carrying inside her a decision that would change the shape of everything that came after. A decision to stop defending herself in a place built on old loyalties and whispered fears, and to seek instead a truth that no one, not even her own sister, could talk her way around. The road to the Moon Court began before sunrise, with her mother pressing a small bundle of food into her hands and refusing, stubbornly, to let her tears show even as her voice shook. "You don't have to do this alone," her mother said. "Your father could go with you. I could go with you." "I need to do this myself," Ilara said, and it was true, though she could not have explained why with any precision. Perhaps it was that she needed, after weeks of being spoken about, whispered over, and quietly erased from her own story, to be the one who walked into the next chapter of it, on her own 2 feet. "If I bring family, it will look like I need someone to speak for me. I need them to hear my own voice." Her father, standing near the door with his arms crossed, the way he always stood when he was trying not to show worry, finally stepped forward and pulled her into a brief, hard embrace. "Come back to us," he said gruffly. "Whatever happens there, come back." "I will." She did not see Wren that morning. Her sister's absence felt, even then, like its own kind of statement, though Ilara chose not to examine too closely what that statement might mean. She left before the sun had fully cleared the hills, walking the narrow road out of the valley, with the false charm wrapped carefully in cloth and tucked deep in her travel bag, alongside a letter from Adeline, formally acknowledging that a dispute had been raised and could not be settled locally, a small but necessary piece of paper that would open the Moon Court's doors to her at all. The journey was long. The Moon Court sat at the center of territory shared by a dozen packs, a neutral ground built generations ago, specifically so that disputes too large or too tangled for any single valley could be judged fairly, without the weight of old loyalties tipping the scale. It would take her the better part of a week on foot and cart to reach it, and she spent the first 2 days of that journey mostly in silence, replaying every conversation of the past month, searching for details she might have missed, threads she might still be able to pull. On the 3rd day, she reached the market town of Alder's Cross, a waypoint where travelers from a dozen valleys stopped to trade and rest, before continuing on to wherever their business took them. She had planned only to buy supplies and move on, but as she stood haggling over the price of dried meat with a merchant, she overheard 2 women speaking nearby about the very trouble she had left behind. "Heard it from a cousin near the western ridge," one of them was saying. "Something about a girl and a curse, Bad business. Alara turned, unable to stop herself. Forgive me, did you say Western Ridge? The woman, an older traveler with a weathered, not unkind face, studied her for a moment before answering. My cousin's family keeps goats out that way. Lost 2 of them a few weeks back. No explanation for it. Strange thing was, my cousin swore afterward that a young woman had come by not long before, asking odd questions, offering coin for information about who might be watching the pens that night. Alara's pulse quickened. Do you know her name? The young woman? No, only that she wasn't from that farm's own valley. Traveled in special, my cousin thought, though she never said why. It was not proof, not yet, not the kind that would satisfy a court. But it was a thread, and Alara pulled it as far as she could, buying the woman a meal, and coaxing out every detail she could remember, a rough description that matched Ren closely enough to steal the breath from Alara's chest, and, more importantly, the name of the cousin who might remember more. She changed her route that afternoon, adding 2 days to her journey, and traveled instead to the Western Ridge farm, where a broad-shouldered farmer named Garrick greeted her with the wary politeness of a man who had already had more than enough trouble that season. It took her the better part of an hour, and the last of her patience, to convince him she meant no harm, and only wanted the truth of what had happened to his goats. There was a girl, he admitted finally, sitting heavily on an overturned crate outside his barn. Came by maybe 3 days before it happened. Said she was doing research for the elders, asking about our night watch schedule, when the animals were left unattended, whether we'd noticed anything strange in the area before. Seemed harmless enough at the time, paid well for my trouble in answering. Would you recognize her again? Or swear to what you've told me, before a formal court? Garrick's face tightened with the particular reluctance of a plain, private man being asked to step into a world of politics and formal proceedings he had no interest in. I don't want trouble, he said. Whatever's between you and whoever this girl is, that's your business. She may have killed your goats herself, Alara said quietly, or arranged for it to happen, so that the blame would fall on someone else, someone innocent. If that's true, don't you want the truth known? He was silent for a long moment, turning the request over with obvious discomfort, and then, slowly, he nodded. I'll speak the truth if I'm asked to, he said. I won't chase after your court to offer it, but if they send for me, I won't lie. It was enough. It was more than enough, given how little she'd had only days before. Alara thanked him and continued on her way, her bag now heavier, not with supplies, but with the accumulating weight of small, hard-won pieces of truth, each one a stone she intended to lay, eventually, at the feet of the moon court. The road grew harder after that. On the 5th day, crossing a stretch of forest known for its uncertain footing, she found herself followed. She noticed it first as a prickling unease at the back of her neck, the sense of being watched that every creature, human or otherwise, learns to trust, even when it cannot explain it. She quickened her pace, and the presence behind her quickened too, staying always just out of clear sight among the trees. She stopped finally at a bend in the road, turning to face the woods directly. I know you're there, she called out, her voice steadier than she felt. Show yourself, or leave me be. A young man stepped out from among the trees, someone she recognized distantly from the valley, a cousin of one of Ren's closer friends. He looked uncomfortable, shifting his weight from foot to foot, clearly wishing he were anywhere else. I was sent to see where you were headed, he admitted, when pressed. And to tell you, if I found you, that it isn't too late to turn back. That whatever's waiting for you at the moon court might not be worth what it cost you to get there. Sent by whom? He didn't answer, but he didn't need to. Alara understood, standing in that quiet forest with the weight of the truth pressing in around her, that her sister had grown afraid enough to send someone after her, not to stop her outright, which would have been too obvious, too damning, but to plant one more small seed of doubt, one more soft suggestion that turning back might be easier than pressing forward. Tell whoever sent you, she said, that I'm not turning back. Tell them I found the Western Ridge. Tell them exactly that, and see what they say. The young man's face paled slightly, and he retreated back into the trees without another word, leaving Alara alone on the forest road with her heart pounding, and a strange, fierce clarity blooming in her chest. If Ren was frightened enough to send someone after her, then Ren understood, better than anyone, how close the truth had already come. She walked the rest of that day faster than she had walked any of the days before it, driven now not only by the need to reach the moon court, but by the certainty, hard and bright as the evening star rising ahead of her on the darkening road, that she was no longer chasing a shadow. The shadow, for the first time, was chasing her. By the seventh day, the forest gave way to open hills, and in the distance, rising pale and unmistakable against the horizon, Ilara saw for the first time the white towers of the moon court. She had heard descriptions of it her whole life, in the way children hear about places they never expect to visit, a fortress of old stone and older law, built at the crossing point of a dozen territories so that no single pack could claim ownership of the justice dispensed within its walls. Seeing it now, real and enormous, and gleaming faintly silver in the afternoon light, she felt the scale of what she was about to attempt settle over her fully for the first time. She was not the only traveler on the road that final stretch. As she drew nearer to the outer gates, she passed others heading in the same direction, some clearly petitioners like herself, nervous and travel-worn, others clearly officials or attendants moving with the brisk efficiency of people who worked within these walls every day. She fell into step, without meaning to, behind an older woman carrying a scroll case, who introduced herself as a record keeper for one of the northern packs. "First time?" the woman asked, glancing at Ilara's plain travel clothes and the careful way she carried her bag, as though it held something precious. "Yes. Petitioner or witness?" "Petitioner." The woman's expression softened slightly, the particular sympathy of someone who had seen many nervous young petitioners pass through these gates before. "Bring everything you have. Don't hold anything back out of fear it isn't enough. The court is more thorough than you'd expect. They'll find the truth if it's there to be found, but you have to be willing to lay it all out for them to see." Ilara thanked her and continued on alone, and within the hour she stood before the outer gate itself, where a pair of formally dressed attendants took down her name, her purpose, and the letter from Adeline that formally opened the door to her petition. She was told, with brisk efficiency, that her case would need to be reviewed before a formal hearing could be scheduled, and that in the meantime she would be given lodging within the court's outer halls, alongside the other petitioners and witnesses awaiting their turns. The halls themselves were unlike anything Ilara had seen in her life. High stone ceilings carved with old symbols she did not recognize, long corridors lined with quiet, watchful attendants, and everywhere, underlying the whole place like a held breath, a sense of weight, of consequence, of a justice too large and too old to be easily fooled. She understood, walking those corridors for the first time, why Adeline had warned her so gravely before she left. This was not a place where a whispered rumor could quietly poison an entire community over the course of weeks. This was a place built specifically to catch such rumors and hold them up to a light too bright for them to survive. She spent the first 2 days in a state of restless waiting, reviewing her evidence again and again, the false charm, the merchant woman's account, Garrick's reluctant testimony, the strange encounter in the forest, arranging and rearranging the pieces in her mind, until she could recite the whole sequence of events without a single stumble. She practiced, not because she doubted the truth of what she carried, but because she understood, with growing clarity, that the truth alone was not always enough. It had to be presented in a way that could not be twisted, could not be reframed, could not be turned back on her, the way her sister had turned every previous accusation back on her before. On the third day, word reached her, delivered by a calm, unreadable attendant, that her case had been accepted for formal hearing, and that the opposing party, her sister, had already been summoned and was, in fact, already traveling toward the court herself, having apparently anticipated the summons before it arrived. Ilara felt a cold jolt at that news. Of course Ren had anticipated it. Ren had built this entire elaborate structure of lies, with the same patient, forward-thinking care she brought to everything, and it should not have surprised Ilara that her sister would move quickly to shape her own defense the moment she understood a formal hearing was inevitable. What did surprise her, 4 days later, was who accompanied Ren through the court's outer gates. Ilara was crossing the central courtyard, on her way to a meeting with the attendant assigned to help her prepare her formal statement, when she saw them arrive, her sister, dressed carefully in soft, unassuming colors, meant to suggest humility rather than guilt, and beside her, looking exhausted and uncertain in a way that struck Alara somewhere deep and unguarded, Kale. He had come. Not summoned as her mate exactly, since the bond between them was still new enough that the court had no formal claim on his presence, but he had come anyway, walking beside her sister with the careful, neutral distance of a man determined not to appear to have chosen a side before the truth had been properly weighed. Their eyes met across the courtyard, and for a long, suspended moment, neither of them moved. Alara saw in his face something that was not quite apology and not quite resolve, something caught painfully between the two, and she understood, with a clarity that ached, that he had come not to stand against her, but because he could not bear to stay away, because whatever doubt had crept into him over the past weeks, some deeper part of him still needed to see this through to its true end, whatever that end turned out to be. Ren, walking beside him, offered Alara a small, sorrowful smile, the kind meant to be read by any onlooker as gracious, forgiving, the very picture of a sister still hoping for reconciliation, despite being wronged. Alara did not return it. She had spent too many weeks now, learning to see past that particular expression, to feel anything but a cold, steady resolve settle over her at the sight of it. "I didn't expect you to bring him," Alara said quietly, when Ren drew close enough to speak, without being overheard by the attendants moving through the courtyard. "I didn't bring him," Ren said. "He asked to come. I could hardly refuse a man who wanted to see for himself where the truth lands." "Where the truth lands," Alara repeated. "You say that like you're not afraid of it." Something flickered behind Ren's eyes, there and gone so quickly that anyone less familiar with her sister's face might have missed it entirely. But Alara had grown up watching that face for 20 years, and she recognized fear when she finally saw it plainly. "I'm not afraid of anything," Ren said, "because I've done nothing wrong." "Then you won't mind," Alara said, "when they ask you to swear to that, under the court's own truth binding." For the first time since this entire ordeal had begun, Alara watched her sister's carefully maintained composure falter, just slightly, just for a moment, before smoothing back over into practiced calm. It was such a small thing, a flicker, a half-second delay before the reassuring smile returned, but Alara had learned, over the long, hard weeks that had brought her to this courtyard, to read every flicker for exactly what it was worth, and this one told her more than any words could have. Her sister was afraid, and in 3 days, when the formal hearing began, that fear would have nowhere left to hide. The 3 days before the hearing passed slower than any Alara had lived through in her life, each hour stretched thin by anticipation. She spent them preparing, walked carefully through every detail of her account by an attendant named Leora, a calm, precise woman whose role, she explained, was not to argue Alara's case for her, but to ensure she understood exactly how the court's proceedings worked, so that nothing about the process itself would catch her unprepared. "The truth-binding rite is not magic in the way village stories describe it," Leora told her, on the second afternoon, as they sat together in a small stone room lined with old records. "It doesn't force anyone to speak. It doesn't read minds. What it does is far more precise, and in some ways more merciless. Anyone who submits to it and then speaks a deliberate falsehood will feel it. A physical discomfort, difficult to hide, growing worse the larger the lie. Small omissions, uncertain memories, honest confusion, those pass through mostly unmarked. But a calculated, knowing lie does not go unnoticed, not by the right, and not by anyone watching closely enough to see how the speaker's composure begins to strain. And if she refuses to submit to it, she won't be able to refuse, not entirely. Anyone bringing formal testimony before this court agrees to it as a condition of being heard at all. Your sister will know that, which means she has already decided, whatever she says in that hearing room, that she believes she can survive it. That thought unsettled Alara more than she expected. If Ren had chosen to come here at all, chosen to walk willingly into a place designed specifically to expose calculated lies, she must have believed she had some way through it, some careful arrangement of half-truths and technical honesty that could slip past the binding's notice, the way she had slipped past every other obstacle so far. "Is there a way to lie and still pass the test?" Alara asked. Leora considered the question carefully before answering. Not truly lie, no, but a clever enough speaker can sometimes shape their words to be technically true, while still deeply misleading. They can answer only the exact question asked, and no more. They can speak of their own beliefs and feelings, which the binding cannot fully measure, since a person can sincerely believe something untrue. It is not impossible to survive the rite while still deceiving the court. It is only very difficult, and it requires a discipline most people, when finally standing before it, find they do not have. Alara turned that answer over for the rest of the day, and found in it a strange comfort. Her sister was clever, certainly, cleverer than Alara had given her credit for through most of their childhood. But cleverness under calm, private conditions, with weeks to plan every word in advance, was one thing. Cleverness under the weight of a formal hearing, in front of an entire panel of the court's most experienced judges, with the truth-binding right pressing down on every answer, was another thing entirely. On the morning of the third day, she woke before dawn, dressed carefully in the simple, formal clothing the court had provided for petitioners, and made her way to the outer courtyard, where she found Kale waiting, alone, near the entrance to the hearing hall. He looked as though he hadn't slept. She understood the feeling. "I wanted to see you before it started," he said, "not to say anything that would sway your case, or hers, just to see you." "You've been staying away from me," she said. It wasn't quite an accusation, though it carried the shape of one. "I've been trying to be fair," he said, "to both of you. I know how that must look. I know it might feel like I abandoned you these past weeks, and maybe I did, in ways I'm only now beginning to understand. But Alara, I need you to know something. Whatever happens in there today, the moment I felt our bond, I felt something true. I have never once, in all of this, stopped feeling it. The doubt I carried, it never touched that. It only sat beside it, ugly and unwelcome, whispering things I didn't want to hear. And now? Now, he said, I want to hear the truth. All of it, whatever it costs. I'm done living inside the fear other people have handed me." She wanted, badly, to close the distance between them, to let herself lean into the warmth of him, the way she had on that first easy evening on the ridge, weeks and a lifetime ago. But some careful, guarded part of her held back, unwilling to fully trust that warmth again, until she had watched it survive what was coming. "Then watch closely today," she said, "and decide for yourself what you believe, once you've seen it plainly." He nodded, and together, though several careful paces apart, they walked toward the hearing hall, where the court's judges were already taking their seats, and where, in a small chamber just beyond the great doors, Ren sat alone, rehearsing, one final time, the careful architecture of a story she was about to discover, could not survive the weight of the truth pressing in against it from every side. The doors opened at mid-morning, and the formal hearing of Alara against her sister Ren, concerning claims of fabricated curse and deliberate deception, began before a panel of 5 judges, the eldest of whom, a stern, silver-haired woman named Rosalind, called the hall to order with a single measured knock of her staff against the stone floor. "This court exists," Rosalind said, her voice carrying easily through the hushed hall, "not to favor blood or bond, not to favor the sympathetic story over the difficult one, but to find, as precisely as we are able, what is true. Both parties understand that whatever is spoken here today, under the binding, will be spoken at cost if it is false. Do both parties understand this, and do both parties consent?" "I do," Alara said, her voice steady. There was a pause, brief but noticeable, before Ren answered. "I do," she said, and though her voice carried the same practiced calm it always had, Alara, watching closely, saw her sister's hands tighten almost imperceptibly in her lap. "Then let us begin," Rosalind said, "and let us find, together, where the truth of this matter truly lies." Alara was called to speak first, and she rose from her seat, feeling the eyes of the entire hall settle on her at once, a weight she had not fully prepared for, despite days of practice. She spoke plainly, the way Leora had coached her, laying out the sequence of events in careful order. The garden's sudden ruin the morning after her bonding, the goats found dead on a farm she had no recent connection to, the rumors that had spread through her valley with a speed and precision that felt, in hindsight, far too coordinated to be accidental. She described the charm she had found buried behind the old well, and at Rosalind's request, presented it to the court's attendants for formal examination. "You believe this object was planted," Rosalind said, turning the wrapped charm over in gloved hands, "specifically to be discovered and mistaken for evidence of genuine dark practice." "I do." "And you believe your sister planted it?" "I do." "Did you feel any discomfort as you say that?" Ilara paused, understanding the purpose of the question. A test not of her sister's honesty, but of her own. A check to ensure the binding was working as intended on both sides of the dispute. "No," she said, "none." Rosalind nodded, satisfied, and gestured for her to continue. Ilara went on to describe the merchant woman's account of a young stranger asking odd questions near the Western Ridge farm, and Garrick's reluctant but genuine confirmation that just such a young woman had visited before his goats were found dead. She described the encounter in the forest, the young man sent to discourage her from continuing her journey, and the way her sister's composure had visibly cracked, if only for a moment, in the courtyard 3 days before. Throughout it all, she felt nothing of the discomfort Rosalind had asked about, no strain, no hesitation beyond the ordinary nervousness of speaking before such a formidable panel. The binding, invisible but unmistakably present in the careful attentiveness of the judges' faces, seemed to confirm, again and again, that every word she spoke was exactly as true as she believed it to be. When she finally sat down, her hands trembling now not from fear, but from the release of tension she had carried the entire length of her testimony, Rosalind turned her attention to Wren. "You have heard your sister's account," Rosalind said. "You may respond." Wren rose slowly, gracefully, every movement calibrated to project calm sincerity. "I have heard it," she said, "and it grieves me deeply to hear my own sister accuse me of such things. I love Ilara. I have always loved her, even when it has been difficult. Even when I have watched her receive attention and affection, I sometimes envied as a younger sister does. But envy is not the same as malice, and I have done nothing to deliberately harm her." "Did you visit the Western Ridge farm prior to the death of the animals there?" Rosalind asked. A pause. Ilara watched it closely, watched the careful calculation moving behind her sister's eyes. "I traveled through that area, yes," Wren said finally. "I do not recall the specific purpose. I travel often, visiting distant relations and old family friends." "Did you ask the farmer questions about the timing of his night watch?" "I don't recall the specifics of any conversation I may have had." Ilara felt her jaw tighten. It was exactly the kind of careful, technically evasive answer Leora had warned her about, not an outright lie, but a fog of convenient forgetfulness designed to slip past the binding's notice without triggering the discomfort a knowing falsehood would cause. "Did you bury a charm behind your family's old well?" Rosalind asked, her voice sharpening slightly, intending for it to be discovered as evidence of a curse that does not exist. This time, the pause stretched longer, and Ilara saw, unmistakably now, the faint sheen of sweat gathering at her sister's temple, the almost imperceptible tightness entering her shoulders. "No," Wren said, "I did not bury anything behind the well." The word landed strangely in the hall, and Ilara watched several of the judges exchange brief, significant glances. Rosalind leaned forward slightly. "You understand," she said, "that this court has ways of observing more than the words themselves. Do you wish to reconsider your answer?" Wren's composure, which had held so firmly through weeks of careful lies told to a frightened, credulous valley, finally began, visibly, to strain against the weight of a court built specifically to see past it. She started, and stopped, her hands twisting together in front of her. "I may have visited the well. I don't recall burying anything specific. Did you commission, or arrange, through the elder known as Odette, for a false confirmation of a curse to be given to members of your community?" "I only asked her opinion, as anyone might. Did you offer her payment for that opinion?" The silence that followed stretched long enough that even the attendants along the walls seemed to hold their breath. Wren's face had gone pale now, the practiced calm finally, fully cracking, revealing beneath it something raw and frightened that Ilara had not seen since they were children, since long before either of them had learned to wear the careful masks adulthood seemed to require. Yes, Ren said finally, the word barely audible in the vast stone hall. I paid her. A murmur rose through the gathered witnesses and attendants, quickly silenced by a sharp knock of Rosalind's staff against the floor. Alara sat very still, her heart pounding, watching her sister's composure dissolve piece by piece under the weight of questions that would not permit the comfortable evasions she had relied on for weeks. We will pause here, Rosalind said, and resume this hearing tomorrow, when additional witnesses have been gathered and formally heard. But let the record show that this court has already observed significant strain in the testimony offered today, strain consistent with deliberate deception rather than honest uncertainty. The hall began to empty, attendants and witnesses filing out in hushed, murmuring clusters, and Alara remained seated for a long moment, watching her sister being led from the hall by a pair of court attendants, her earlier grace entirely gone, replaced by the stiff, careful movements of someone trying desperately to hold together something that had already, unmistakably, begun to fall apart. Across the hall, Cale caught her eye one final time before the doors closed between them, and in his expression, for the first time in weeks, Alara saw something unclouded by doubt, not yet relief, not yet full understanding, but the unmistakable beginning of a man watching the truth, finally come into focus. The second day of the hearing brought witnesses Alara had never expected to see, standing before the court on her behalf. Garrick arrived first, looking deeply uncomfortable in formal traveling clothes clearly borrowed for the occasion, twisting his hat in his hands as he waited to be called. When his turn came, he answered every question plainly and without embellishment, describing the young woman who had visited his farm days before his goats were found dead, confirming, under the weight of the binding, that he felt no discomfort in anything he said, because everything he said was simply, unremarkably true. The merchant woman from Alder's Cross arrived next, having been located and summoned by the court's own attendants, once Alara provided her name and the location where she could likely be found. She too confirmed her account without hesitation, describing her cousin's story exactly as she had told it to Alara on the road. But it was Odette's testimony, called late in the afternoon, that finally, completely, unraveled what remained of Ren's careful construction. The old woman entered the hall slowly, leaning on a carved walking stick, her face weathered and unreadable. She had been summoned formally, and unlike Ren, she seemed to carry no illusions about surviving the binding through careful evasion. When Rosalind asked whether she had accepted payment from Ren, in exchange for lending false credibility to rumors of a curse, Odette answered simply and immediately. Yes, she said, I did. Why? Odette's eyes flicked briefly toward Ren, seated rigid and pale at the front of the hall, before returning to Rosalind. Old grievances, she said. Ren's family wronged mine, years ago, in a land dispute I never forgot. When she came to me with coin and a request, I saw an opportunity to cause her family some small measure of the trouble mine had suffered. I am not proud of it, but I will not lie about it now, not in this hall. Did you believe, at the time you spoke of curses to members of the valley, that any such curse was real? No, Odette said. I believed nothing of the kind. I chose my words carefully enough to suggest belief without stating it outright, precisely so that no one could later prove I had lied. It was a cowardly kind of dishonesty, and I regret it now, seeing how far it was allowed to travel. The hall fell into a heavy, charged silence at that admission, and Alara felt something in her chest finally begin to loosen, the long, tight knot of weeks spent fighting against something she couldn't fully see now visibly unraveling, in front of an entire panel of judges who could see it too. Rosalind turned finally to Ren, her expression grave. You have heard the testimony offered today. Do you wish to add anything to your own account, before this court renders judgment? Ren sat very still for a long moment, and when she finally rose, something had changed in her posture, some last defense finally, fully abandoned. When she spoke, her voice was smaller than Alara had ever heard it, stripped of every careful, practiced note it had carried through the hearing's first day. I did it, she said, all of it. I ruined the garden myself, the night after the bonding, using nothing but ordinary poison bought from a traveling merchant, dressed up afterward to look like something stranger than it was. I arranged for the goats to be harmed. Through a debt I called in from someone who owed my family a favor. I buried the charm behind the well. I paid Odette to lend weight to rumors I started myself. In quiet conversations I made sure could never be traced directly back to me. Why? Rosalind asked, her voice gentler now, though no less firm. Tell this court why you did these things to your own sister. Wren's composure, already thin, finally broke completely, her shoulders curling inward, as though trying to shield herself from the weight of her own confession. Because I watched her find something I have wanted my whole life, she said, her voice cracking. A bond. Someone who looked at her the way no one has ever looked at me. I told myself, at first, that I only wanted to slow things down, to give myself time to catch up, to find something of my own, before I had to watch her have everything I didn't. But it grew. Every small lie made the next one easier, and I told myself each time that it was the last, that I would stop before it went too far. I never stopped. I don't fully understand, even now, why I couldn't stop. Alara sat frozen through her sister's confession, feeling a strange, complicated grief move through her. Not forgiveness, not yet, but something adjacent to it, a recognition of the small, wounded girl her sister had once been, buried somewhere beneath the calculated cruelty of the past weeks. Across the hall, Cale's face had gone pale and still, the last of his doubt visibly, finally, collapsing under the weight of a confession too raw and complete to be anything but true. He did not look toward Wren. His eyes found Alara instead and held there, steady, as though anchoring himself against everything he had almost let himself believe. Rosalind allowed the silence to stretch a long moment before speaking again, her voice carrying the full, formal weight of the court behind it. This court has heard testimony, confirmed through binding, sufficient to establish beyond reasonable doubt that the claims brought by Alara against her sister Wren are true in full. We will retire now to determine appropriate sanction and will return before this hearing closes to render final judgment. As the judges rose and filed from the hall, Alara remained seated, watching her sister being led away once more, smaller now, stripped of every careful performance, left with nothing but the plain, unadorned truth of what she had done, and Alara understood, watching her go, that whatever came next, the long, exhausting fight to be believed was, at last, finally over. The court recessed for the evening, promising judgment the following morning, and Alara found herself standing alone in the quiet outer courtyard as the sky over the white towers deepened slowly into dusk. She had expected relief. She had imagined, through every long, hard mile of her journey to this place, that hearing her sister finally confess would feel like the lifting of some enormous weight, a clean and simple joy at finally being believed. Instead, she felt strange and hollow, the truth having cost more to reach than she had anticipated, leaving behind not triumph, but a tired, aching sadness she hadn't prepared herself for. She was still standing there, lost in that unexpected grief, when Cale found her. He approached slowly, giving her every chance to step away if she wanted to, and when she didn't, he came to stand beside her at the courtyard's edge, close but not touching, the space between them charged with everything neither of them had said yet. "I'm sorry," he said finally. "I know those words aren't enough for what these past weeks have cost you, but I need to say them anyway, as many times as it takes for you to believe I mean them." "You believed her," Alara said quietly. It wasn't an accusation, only an observation, spoken plainly into the cooling evening air. "I believed I didn't know what to believe," he said, "which I understand now, was its own kind of failure. I let the fear other people handed me sit beside the truth I felt in my own chest, instead of trusting the truth enough to push the fear out entirely. You deserved better than that from me. From the very beginning, you deserved a mate who trusted the bond between us more than he trusted rumor." She turned to look at him fully for the first time since the hearing had begun, searching his face for the same doubt that had lived there for weeks, and found instead something clearer, steadier, scoured clean by the weight of everything the court had exposed. "I don't know how to simply return to where we were," she admitted. "Too much happened in the space between us. I don't think I can pretend those weeks didn't leave a mark." "I don't want you to pretend," he said. "I want to earn back whatever I lost, however long that takes." I'm not asking you to forget any of this. I'm only asking you to let me try." She didn't answer immediately, and he didn't push her to. They stood together in the quiet courtyard, as the last light faded from the sky, not quite as they had been before, but not as strangers either, something new, and still uncertain, settling slowly into the space where their old, easy trust had once lived. Later that night, an attendant came to her with an unexpected request. Ren, held now in a modest holding chamber within the court's outer walls, had asked to see her, if Elara was willing. She almost refused. Part of her wanted nothing more than to let the court's judgment be the last word between them, to walk away from her sister entirely and never look back. But a larger, more stubborn part of her, the part that still remembered a small girl who used to climb into her bed during thunderstorms, needed to hear whatever her sister had left to say. She found Ren sitting alone in a small, plain room, stripped of the careful elegance she usually wore like armor, looking younger and more fragile than Elara had seen her look in years. "I didn't think you'd come," Ren said. "I almost didn't." Ren was quiet for a moment, turning something over in her hands. A small, worn ribbon Elara recognized from their childhood, one their mother had given each of them as girls. "I don't expect you to forgive me," she said finally. "I don't think I've earned the right to ask for that. I only wanted to say, away from the court, away from anyone watching, that everything I said in that hall was true, all of it. And I am sorry, Elara, not because I was caught. I want you to believe that much, even if you believe nothing else I say ever again. I'm sorry, because I finally let myself see, clearly, what I did to you, what kind of person I let myself become to do it." Elara studied her sister for a long moment, feeling the old, familiar ache of love tangled painfully with the newer, harder ache of betrayal. "I believe that you're sorry," she said finally. "I don't know yet if that's enough to build anything new between us. I think that will take time, maybe a long time, but I don't want to spend whatever life is left to either of us carrying only anger toward you. I'd rather leave room for something else to grow, even if I can't name it yet." Ren's eyes filled, and for the first time in longer than Elara could remember, the tears looked entirely, unmistakably real. "That's more than I deserve," she whispered. "Maybe," Elara said. "But I'd rather give more than someone deserves, than spend my life measuring exactly how much anyone has earned." She left the small room a while later, carrying inside her a complicated tangle of grief, and something that might, someday, with enough careful tending, grow into forgiveness. She did not know yet what shape the rest of her life with her sister would take, but she understood, walking back through the quiet stone halls toward the room she'd been given for the night, that whatever came next would be built on truth instead of lies, and that alone felt like solid ground beneath her feet for the first time in weeks. Morning came clear and bright over the white towers, and the hall filled once more with witnesses and attendants as the 5 judges took their seats for the final time. Rosalind rose to deliver the court's judgment, her voice carrying easily through the hushed hall. "This court has heard testimony, confirmed under binding, establishing that Ren knowingly and deliberately fabricated evidence of a curse against her own sister Elara, causing significant harm to Elara's standing within her home valley, her relationship with her mate, and her overall well-being. This court finds the claims brought before it fully substantiated." A murmur passed through the hall, quickly stilled by the weight of Rosalind's continuing voice. "In accordance with this court's law, Ren is stripped of formal standing within her home pack for a period of 3 years, during which time she may not hold position of trust or influence within her community, and must make formal amends, as determined by the elders of her own valley, to every individual harmed by the false rumors she spread. She is further ordered to provide restitution to the farmer Garrick for the animals lost under circumstances she herself arranged. The elder Odette, for her role in lending false credibility to these claims, is likewise sanctioned, though this court recognizes some mitigation in her willingness to testify fully and honestly once summoned." Ren stood silently through the reading of her sentence, her head bowed, accepting the judgment without protest or plea, a stark contrast to the careful, practiced defiance she had carried into the hall only 2 days before. "As for Elara," Rosalind continued, her voice softening slightly, "this court formally clears her name of any and all claims raised against her, and directs that this judgment be carried back to her home valley, to be read publicly before the full pack, so that whatever damage was done to her standing there may be as fully undone as this court is able to accomplish. Elara felt the words settle over her like something warm, finally reaching skin that had been cold for far too long. She had not realized, until that moment, how much weight she had been carrying, simply in not knowing whether she would ever be fully, publicly believed. Hearing it spoken now, formally, permanently, by a court whose word carried weight across a dozen territories, felt like watching a door that had been slammed shut weeks ago finally swing open again. The hearing closed shortly after, the hall slowly emptying as witnesses and attendants dispersed to their own business, and Elara found herself standing once more in the outer courtyard, blinking against the bright morning light, trying to absorb the strange, quiet relief of having finally, completely, reached the other side of everything she had fought so hard to survive. Cale found her there, as she somehow knew he would, and this time, when he reached for her hand, she let him take it, feeling the old warmth of their bond settle between them, steadier now, tempered by everything they had both endured to reach this point. "I meant what I said last night," he told her. "I want to earn back what I lost, however long it takes." "It won't take as long as you think," she admitted, feeling something in her chest finally, fully unclench. "I never stopped loving you, even through the worst of it. I was only afraid to trust that you'd find your way back to me before it was too late." "I found my way back," he said. "I'm here. I'm not going anywhere again." They walked together out of the court's great gates that afternoon, beginning the long journey home, and though the road ahead would still carry its own difficulties, a valley to face again, a sister's absence to adjust to, a trust between them both that would need careful, patient rebuilding, Elara walked it lighter than she had walked any road in weeks, no longer carrying the crushing weight of an unproven truth, but instead the steady, solid ground of a truth the whole world now knew. Behind them, in the quiet stone halls of the Moon Court, Ren began the long process of her own reckoning, carrying forward not the elaborate lies she had once built so carefully, but the plain, difficult work of becoming someone worth trusting again. And ahead of them, waiting at the end of the long road home, lay a valley that would soon hear the truth read aloud, before the full pack, a mother and father who would finally be able to stop holding their breath, and a life that Elara intended, at long last, to build not on rumor or fear, but on the simple, hard-won foundation of things proven true. She reached the ridge above her valley 3 days later, Cale walking steady beside her, and paused there for a long moment, looking down at the small, familiar cluster of homes and fields that had once turned so sharply against her. The frost from weeks before had finally melted. The garden, she would learn soon enough, had already begun, slowly and stubbornly, to grow green again. She took a breath and began the walk down toward home.